The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. It's good to have you all here, fresh off of last night's special programming. This is a live call-in show, so you are encouraged to call in and ask us and primarily our guest tonight questions and voice your comments and observations. The number here is 343-9927, 343-9927. If you're out of town and live streaming on WHYR.org, then dial the area code 225, then 343-9927. Okay, for tonight we're going to discuss social disparities in general and what our guest is dealing with, or what I guess people in her position deal with to address those sorts of things, what they are and how we approach those problems. In the studio tonight we have Dr. Leslie Taylor Grover. She is Associate Professor for Public Policy and Administration at Southern University, and her expertise is in social disparities. Good evening, Dr. Leslie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure, believe me. So, social disparities, can you give a short description of what they are, or a definition?
It just means unequal. And when you look at social things, that's anything that we deal with basically as humans, whether it's education, whether it's food, whether it's housing.
That's kind of a problem that has existed all over the world since human beings have existed, isn't it?
I would say so, yeah.
How long has it been a science or something that people study?
Oh, that's a good question. It really kicked off in the 1960s, as did most social sciences, when we were in the middle of social movements and being able to look at these things, but we also had the science to be able to look at large groups and do computer-based things and count a little bit better than we've ever been able to.
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but chances are the just complete lack of communication. We couldn't keep demographic statistics on other countries as well, or anything like that. Yeah,
right.
That's cool. And you apply your in your job with public policy and administration. That's where you direct your efforts, or what?
Yes. Public policy is such an interdisciplinary field. There's policy in everything, in every field just about. And public policy in and of itself is kind of a new field compared to other social sciences. We've only been around as a field, really being recognized separately since about the 1970s, something like that.
Okay, when you talk about policy, you mean government policy?
Basically, government policy, public policy in particular, is instances where there's a need for government intervention, or depending on how you look at things, not the need for government intervention, but it's when government gets involved in addressing a problem or an issue. What
are the ways, the ways I could think of that a government would address or attempt to address those things is through redistributing taxes and things like that. Infrastructure,
taxation, also, administrative law in terms of what agencies can do, policies, regulations, all that type of thing, programming.
What about educating the citizens? I guess let's back up. What is it that causes these disparities? I know economics is a big thing. The people that are really comfortable move off to one place, and will you talk on that?
Yeah, disparities can have many sources. But I guess when you look at it, if you want to talk about two things, and I guess I can try to give you a framework on it, it's really the ratio between disadvantage and opportunity. So when you have disadvantages tend to cascade. So What I mean by that is one disadvantage can make you have another one, and then trying to fix that can lead to another one. So we'll use a really simple case, say education, and a kid is not doing well. You could go to a great school, great teachers, great resources, but say you're not doing well. But also say you come from a poor family, and maybe your parents aren't involved. So,
and the parents may not be that well educated either, so they can't help you. Yeah.
So right there, you've got two sort of disadvantages where you may not be well educated as a parent, and now you're having problems because you're disenfranchised being able to go and advocate on behalf of your child. So maybe it starts early, as a lot of issues tend to do, and maybe you get labeled as a bad student. And so even when teachers help you, that's a good thing, right, to get help, to have teachers who care to do that. But
yes.
Now you've already been labeled as a bad kid, so that is reinforced. And so that kind of leads to, it sort of almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in sometimes.
So the adults, you become labeled by the adults too, the people that are supposed to be helping you, they take that attitude
also? You can. I mean, and that's just one way
right.
the disadvantage happens. Now, on the other end, opportunity is not when you have advantages that bad things don't happen, but if they happen at a slower pace, or if you have resources to insulate
right,
you,
sure.
or that will give you stability while you recover from one disadvantage, they tend not to compound over time.
Sure, we see a lot of kids with disabilities of one kind or another, but the parents, we see them on TV, and the parents are going out and finding specialists or
right.
Things like that. But if you don't have parents that can do that, or you don't have the money to be able to do that,
or you don't have access to health care
right,
or mental health, then those are the types of things. So if you want to look at disparities as a high disadvantage ratio to low advantage, that's one way to do it. But disparity can also be promulgated through lots of other mechanisms, through region, for instance, through the job market itself. Some jobs pay higher than others, through education, through race, through gender, through class. There's just many ways of education that disparity can come about. When we study it, the big places we usually look, particularly here in the U.S., is race. Because given the social history of the United States, race is sort of a proxy for a lot of the inequalities that people experience.
Is it? Okay, yes, I guess it's a proxy in that regard, but it's the most visible too, really. But it's certainly not the only one, I guess. But I mean, but it's probably with race. I guess there's more people being hurt by it, maybe.
Yes, I mean, and we tend to think black and white. But if we think about it, I mean, slavery, of course, sharecroppers, there were white sharecroppers. Think about the time in the Midwest when the banks and famine sort of cleared out issues there. Then Native Americans being moved to reservations. So, and then certain types of legislation have also underscored that. And a lot of it was race-based as well, like housing or the opium laws or drug laws, arguably. So, it's really complex, but race is usually where a lot of researchers start.
Okay. Yeah, and it's race, I guess, in this particular instance, that then resulted in economic disparities, which end up playing out in virtually everything else.
Right.
Health, education, and whatnot, yeah.
Right, absolutely.
We talked last night a little bit about the black communities. Initially, they were isolated from the rest of society, but they still had thriving businesses, local businesses. They were able to fund things. There were even communities that were starting to grow. And then other policies, I guess, broke that up and ended that.
Well, yeah, but also there were housing policies in particular that did that on purpose, that put that into place. U.S. housing policy has really underscored a lot of the racial isolated instances of poverty and disparity that we see. And in trying to fix it, sometimes they made it worse. So there's a lot. Housing policy is one of the worst failures of American public policy ever.
And Dr. Grover, this is Brian Marks, Programming Committee Chair at Baton Rouge Community Radio. I wanted to speak to that about Baton Rouge. One of the obvious lines across our city is the Florida line, north of Florida, south of Florida. Just on that question of housing, we could think about other things too, but Talk to us about the history of how Baton Rouge came to be black and white and how that line was established, and how housing plays into that. How did we become, even though legally segregation is gone, we're still this very segregated city?
Yeah, well, I would say there are two kind of layers, two tiers to that. First of all, let's start with the civil rights movement, which is the obvious place to start. The thing about the civil rights movement is, while the laws were put into place, the existing laws and regulations sort of weren't touched in terms of the racial and the disparity things that were in them. And then if we take that if we put that over Baton Rouge is like a lot of cities, most cities I'll say, and realtors and banks and people who decide where housing is all had a role to play in that. So, for instance, I'm a black person, and let's say I wanted to move into your neighborhood, and, the realtor I would go to wouldn't even show me houses there. They wouldn't. When the realtor was able to show me houses, the list of houses or whatever, it's something called redlining, where cities were sectioned off. And they said, okay, we want black people here. We're going to put people from whatever race sort of everywhere. But particularly when it came to black people and Asians at the time, there was a lot of redlining going on. And if it even, and let's say that barrier was broken when time came for financing, let's say I could get a house, I would be denied. And there's a lot of reasons that housing did that. Now, in urban areas, what started to happen, because it's happened here in Baton Rouge and a lot of areas, was after years and years of all of that being compounded, what you had were isolated racial areas. And then with isolated areas where there's not much economic opportunity, there's some other things that people start, they talk about crime, they talk about lack of access to transportation, they talk about lack of access to food, they talk about lack of access, and maybe businesses don't want to locate there. But because the people who could move did move, maybe the people who are left there can't start their own businesses because, number one, it's difficult to get a business loan to start up a business. And there are permits required, even if you're selling things out of your house. So there's a lot of things that exist in the system that make cities follow that pattern. And Baton Rouge is not any different in any respect from any other city. Now, there are some amazing things about Baton Rouge that should make it easier to overcome those things and that other cities don't have. For instance, there's an HBCU here. There's LSU here. There's, well-educated people on both sides of that Florida line. But the segregation still does exist, very much so, in ways that we don't think about. Economically, in particular, that's the biggest thing we see, and of course, access to health care and resources. And that access to health care, that's symbolic of the health of your workforce. And nobody wants to go where your workforce is unhealthy, because unhealthy people cost a lot of money. And so if your bottom line is profit, you don't want to go there. So and a lot of people will say it's crime, but there's crime everywhere. But it's that health care and that access that makes it more expensive. Your insurance rates are higher. It's just much more expensive to locate in a racially isolated area and a blighted area without government intervention. Now, there you asked about public policy earlier,
Right.
Wayne. That's where policy would come in, with tax incentives, with helping with pricing out profit and making it better there.
But then we get people like those who wanted to split off with St. George saying, I don't want to pay my taxes for those people. And how do you, where, that comes from the individuals or the people. There's a failure there somewhere, either collectively on their part or our part, or did we miss something? Do they not teach civics in schools anymore? Why are so many people unaware of the need for all of the community to reach at least a minimum standard?
I don't know, but I think what I've seen is that a lot of people either another thing about having a lot of opportunity is that it insulates you from those types of things. You don't think about it on a daily basis. I'll give you an example. I was driving through North Baton Rouge, and I saw a lot of elderly people standing out, and they had on parkas.
Mm-hmm.
And, not thinking, I thought, my goodness, why? It's July. Even Satan himself is not outside. It's just that hot. Good gracious.
And they're outside with parkas and coats,
on.
yeah.
But then, when I thought about it, okay, what makes people so cold that they would be in parkas in the summertime? What health conditions? Diabetes, thyroid problems, Alzheimer's disease. And then I thought, well, of course, there's not access to health care. Of course they're cold. Of course they've got these issues. So, of course I'm going to see more elderly, sick, black people standing out in North Baton Rouge in parkas than I am in other parts of the city. So but not thinking, those indicators,
Right, yeah, and most common citizens wouldn't think anything of it. They think, oh, they're weird or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they wouldn't even be charitable in their questions about it. You're listening to A Pause for Thought. This is Wayne Parker. We have Dr. Leslie Grover from Southern University here. We also have Kendall Losey in the studio and Brian Marks. I neglected to introduce them when we kicked off, and Brian took care of that for himself. But nevertheless, good evening, Kendall.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm fine. Dr. Leslie, you mentioned about how people who become well off and become isolated. I think we talked a little bit yesterday before going on the air about these people that think that they've achieved their success all by themselves through their hard work. What would you say to that?
I would say that is a horrible skewing of American ideals. Because that's part of the American dream, right? You work hard. You're an individual.
And that's where they're coming from.
That's where
They're comparing their lives to that myth. I did it all myself. But
Mm-hmm.
does anybody nowadays can anybody do it all themselves?
No. I mean, we are all dependent upon one another. Let's say I educate myself. The information has to come from somewhere. And let's say I open my own business and I've done it all by myself and I did it from scratch and I'm upwardly mobile and I've achieved this dream. I need customers.
Yeah. And my thinking on that angle too is that just to get the building where your business is located built, you needed people to dig ditches.
Right.
You needed people to run your sewer lines and everything else, and you need people to haul your garbage away every week, your sanitation workers and whatnot. All these people are important. And I've often wondered if maybe they're not the most important, because you can't really run a successful enterprise, and certainly not a community, without someone to take away your waste and bring in your utilities and things like that.
I agree. The service industry and all of these that's actually where we find a lot of the disparities when we look in other places, like the huge cities like San Francisco. We find people who are really, really amazingly, outstandingly just rich, just knock you off your feet rich. And then the people who serve them can't afford to do anything.
Yeah.
Well, where's Baton Rouge fit into the nationwide range of cities in terms of our degree of inequality, our degree of social disparity? Where do we rank?
Let's see. Baton Rouge. Well, it depends on what you're looking at.
Sure.
So one of the measures is something called a Gini coefficient, Gini coefficient, and it looks at the way the income is distributed. And 0 means there's perfect equality, and 1 means there's perfect inequality. So a place like, we think of Sweden as being a really well place. They're about a 25. And then if we look at a place like the Congo or Rwanda, they're at about a 64, 63. They change every year, but those are kind of the most recent ones. Baton Rouge is at 54. Other cities in the U.S. is quite unequal too. So Baton Rouge kind of reflects what the nation is, and we are just a little bit below average in the terms of the way, for southern cities, the way that things are distributed. We're just about below average in terms of how our income is. But a lot of that is because Baton Rouge, compared to other cities, everybody's kind of poor together. You know what I mean? Like, there's not trillionaires and billionaires and then people making $2 an hour here, as it is in some other cities. So because, you know, if we look at race, the average white household makes about $90,000, and the average black household here about $30,000. So that's a lot of inequality, and it is unequal, and it does need to be attention, but that's different from someone making $2 billion a year and someone making $12,000 a year, like we see in other cities.
Well, that's true. It's not as bad, but 3 times what the poor are making. I wonder, I mean, though the people making the better money, I think, would drive up prices because they can afford more expensive things. And like I wonder, I'm not sure, you may know about this with health insurance and things like that, but one of the reasons why we have had so little serious study of that to find, you know, causes to ways of equaling it out is that there's enough people making money on it, and so they don't need to worry about those that can't afford it.
Yeah, I mean, health care is, I mean, maybe a lot of people have heard about the military-industrial complex.
Oh, yeah.
Health care is not really different from that. There's no incentive to help people get better because prescriptions are expensive and there's lots of money to be made. Yeah,
that the incentives there. And you mentioned earlier in the show about our focus on money, and I was just thinking that back then maybe you didn't emphasize that point enough. It seems as though money always comes down to it. We have people talking about letting the oil drilling business destroy our environment. It's something that for which Louisiana is renowned worldwide for the diversity of our environment. And they say, well, look, yeah, we want to protect the environment, but we want money too. We need to have jobs, so we'll go ahead and ruin the environment to keep our jobs.
Well, I think part of that gets back to that American ideal, because aside from individualism, we also have this thing about somehow money and wealth somehow show our merit. You know, if you're rich, then you've worked hard and you're a good American and you've achieved the dream.
You're a success, yes.
Right. When in fact, really, all that really had happened was somebody died and left your name in the will. You didn't really do anything.
Well, and even if you earned it all through hard work and all that with the help of the rest of society, right. What have you got? If all you're going to do is use your wealth to collect things, have 6 or 7 cars, how many cars does this person need, you know, or collect a bunch of art you never look at, what have you achieved? What defines you as a success? And that's how I look at it. Of course, people say, well, you know, you're not rich, so you can think that way, you know.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I mean, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they use their wealth to try to improve everybody else.
And that's what I was going to say. I think there's room for both. I think there's room for people to be very rich and very well off and very charitable. You know, there's room for people. If all of the things were equal, if we were really at the place where we say we are sometimes, because I brought a quote.
Okay. And
I want to share this quote with you. And
let me tell the listeners real quickly, you can call in. I've been remiss again. I've been made to feel insecure about this sort of thing now, but you can call in at 343-9927, 343-9927. Join the discussion, ask Dr. Grover some questions, or give her your perspectives. Okay, go ahead.
This quote comes from a speech that LBJ gave at Howard University. It was a commencement speech, and he says, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you're free to compete with all others, and then justly believe that you have been completely fair." And that gets sort of at the heart of where I'm going to address that. If we had done the opposite of what he's saying, then maybe you can work hard and be upwardly mobile, and it's easy. But a lot of those social things that played into disparity, a lot of the racial things, a lot of the historical things, the chains are off. But the playing field is not
Right. They
level.
haven't fixed any of the damage yet.
Right.
And I think that's probably something that was behind the Supreme Court decision to push affirmative action to address some of those problems. But I wonder if that was kind of getting the cart before the horse in the sense that the kids weren't prepared yet for that much of a challenge. They didn't have the groundwork done yet.
I think
And
so.
and of course, winning hearts and minds. We always brag about trying to do that elsewhere in the world, but passing all those laws isn't going to have a lot of effect, I guess, unless you change people's thinking, and that takes the schools, parents, churches, all the other institutions too. Are you working toward any goal right now? Do you have any vision for how we're going to solve all these problems?
I am,
Well-
and I do. I do what I do because I believe there's a place for research and policy to really change the world. Also, teaching and I don't do any research unless it's going to be used to help, unless it can be applied. I know all the theories, but I'm not a theoretical researcher. So one of the big projects that I'm working on, along with some of my other colleagues and other concerned people, really looks at thinking about ways to begin to heal Baton Rouge, not just emotionally, but also economically, also socially, in all these ways. So a lot of the research I'm doing really is focusing on policy solutions to that.
Kendall?
What kind of policies do you think Baton Rouge need the most to improve the disparities, improve the divide in the city and this disparities in the city?
We need help with housing. We need help with criminal justice reform.
Okay. Can I get you to clarify? Help with housing. What do you mean?
In terms of the way the housing is distributed and the values of property and blighted property and that racial isolation, sort of that's the leftovers from bad policies and racial things, we need to break out of that. We need to look at, like I said, criminal justice, criminal reform, education.
Okay. Well, the criminal justice, too, I wanted you to clarify on that. How do you mean that? I mean, there's obviously a disparity between the people committing crimes and the people going to jail for them.
Right.
Is that what you're talking about? Or
that, and also police reform in terms of the way we police the local community and some of the reactions that we have, because they're the gatekeepers. They're the street-level bureaucrats that decide what happens to people. If I'm speeding and I'm going 100 miles an hour, if I'm wearing you could write me whatever ticket you want to, or you could give me a warning. So, that type of stuff, we need help with that. We need reform with that. And access to health care, of course, and education.
you mean, access to health care, like not shutting down the local charity hospital or
all of that.
bankrupting the emergency room? Yeah.
And also something that's not mental health as well. We had a mental health emergency room here in the city, and it was in North Baton Rouge.
But and we're running close up to our time, but mental illness is something that's been addressed or begun to be addressed relatively recently in our culture anyway. I don't know about elsewhere, but I know when I was growing up, it was considered something that you needed to hide from people and not tell anybody. Mm-hmm. The old myth of the crazy daughter down in the basement, that people hid that because it was a sign of inferiority.
Right.
And so now we're just now beginning to develop an understanding of that, and so that's equally important, especially for disadvantaged communities or people who are struggling. So those are the things you are focusing now.
Yes.
Do you focus a whole lot on achieving all that? I mean, is your happiness and your effort tied to being successful in your lifetime?
No, it can't be, because I don't know that I'll be successful. I believe in something called punctuated equilibrium. I just got through telling you that I don't do theory, but now I'm going to give you a theory.
We all have to have a theory to operate
so
with.
let's just contradict myself here.
Oh, no.
We're live on radio. In biology, there's something called punctuated equilibrium. Little changes to an animal or system cause it to look differently over time.
Right.
It's the same way with policy. As social things happen, as we make changes in policies, we have these adverse things that happen and externalities, we begin to change the system over time.
Okay. Now, I would like to come to your defense for your self-criticism.
Okay.
when you said that you weren't a theory person, I took that to mean that you don't take a theory and then try to implement it.
That's true.
You operate on the ground and try to solve the certain problems in front of you and form a theory out of that.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, you got it. That's it.
Remember that, right?
Yeah.
And
I'm
remember
gonna use
me.
it. I
Yes.
shall.
Anybody else? Kendall? Brian? Guess you're just sitting there enjoying the show, huh? Anyway.
Wonderful guest.
Yes, I thank you,
Thank you.
Dr. Grover. And, yeah, hopefully we can have you back and talk more about this, because I'm sure there's a million things we can talk about regarding this type of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, we got to go. You've been listening to Wayne Parker with a pause for thought. Dr. Leslie Grover from Southern University and Brian Marks and Kendall Losey. You guys have a good night. Thank you for listening.